"Security, remove her. She doesn't belong in this boardroom." The words landed like a hammer against glass, sharp enough to silence a room filled with people who were used to being the loudest voices in the building. At exactly 9:04 on a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, inside the executive boardroom of Whitmore Dynamics, every conversation stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Tablet screens dimmed into the background. 42 stories above the city, where billion-dollar decisions were made every week. One woman stood quietly near the entrance while an entire room decided she didn't belong. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Danielle Brooks. Danielle Brooks, 46 years old, stood calmly beneath the soft glow of recessed lighting, her expression unreadable. She wore a charcoal blazer, dark slacks, and simple black flats. No designer labels. No entourage. No security detail. Nothing about her appearance matched the assumptions already forming around the polished oak table. Across from her sat Richard Whitmore, 58, acting chairman of the company, and a man who had spent the last 6 months enjoying power that was never truly his. His silver tie was perfectly aligned. His confidence looked permanent, at least for now. Richard leaned back in his chair and stared at Danielle as if she had wandered into the wrong building. "I'm going to ask one more time," he said. "Who invited you?" A few members of the board exchanged amused looks. Someone chuckled softly. Another executive glanced at Danielle's shoes before returning to his notes. The room wasn't hostile yet. It was worse. It was dismissive. Danielle looked around the boardroom slowly. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline behind her. Rain streaked the glass in thin silver lines. The city looked distant from up here. Detached. Almost unreal. "I believe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "This meeting is restricted to senior leadership and ownership representatives." The emphasis on ownership drew a few smirks from around the table. Danielle simply nodded. Then her eyes moved toward the far end of the room. The chair at the head of the table sat empty, larger than the others, reserved, untouched, waiting. Richard noticed her looking. His smile widened. "That seat belongs to the owner." The room laughed a little louder this time. Danielle didn't react. She just continued studying the chair. The silence that followed felt different, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath without understanding why. Richard tapped a folder against the table. "Ma'am, if you're here for administrative support, there's a conference room on the 22nd floor." More laughter. Danielle remained still. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. Inside, something else was building. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something far more dangerous. Patience. Near the side wall, a young executive assistant named Maya Johnson glanced up from her tablet. She had been organizing meeting notes all morning, barely paying attention to the conversation. But now she was staring directly at Danielle. Something about her seemed familiar. Not familiar in the way strangers sometimes do. Familiar in a way that made Maya's stomach tighten. She couldn't place it yet. Not completely. But the feeling refused to leave. Richard stood and adjusted his jacket. "Last chance," he said. "Either tell us who you are, or security can help you find the exit." Danielle finally looked away from the empty chair and met his eyes. Her expression never changed. Neither did her posture. Yet somehow the room felt smaller than it had 30 seconds earlier. "You really want to do that?" she asked. Richard didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." For the first time all morning, Danielle smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was the smile of someone watching a door close moments before another one opens. And nobody in that boardroom realized they had just made the most expensive mistake of their careers. The smile unsettled Richard more than he wanted to admit. It appeared for only a moment, then disappeared, but somehow it lingered in the room long after Danielle Brooks lowered her gaze. Around the table, executives shifted in their seats. The confidence that had fueled their amusement minutes earlier began to thin at the edges. Richard refused to notice it. He had spent too many years commanding rooms like this one to be rattled by a stranger standing near the door. Or at least that was what he told himself. He straightened a stack of reports and glanced toward the empty chair at the head of the boardroom table. Nobody had sat there in months. Technically, It belonged to the controlling owner of Whitmore Dynamics. Practically, it had become a symbol, a reminder of an authority that rarely appeared in person. Richard had grown comfortable with that arrangement, comfortable enough to act as if the chair belonged to him. "Security is on the way," he said casually. "We can move forward once this distraction is handled." Several board members nodded. One of them, Thomas Reynolds, folded his hands and smiled. "We have a merger vote in 20 minutes. We do not have time for interruptions." Danielle listened quietly. Her eyes drifted across framed photographs mounted along the far wall. Images of company milestones stretched back decades. Product launches, ribbon cuttings, awards, celebrations. Each photograph captured a different chapter of Whitmore Dynamics. None of the executives seemed interested in them. Yet Danielle studied every frame as though she remembered where she had been when each picture was taken. Maya noticed that too. The feeling in her stomach tightened further. She opened her tablet and searched through archived executive records while pretending to organize meeting notes. A name surfaced, then a photograph. Maya blinked. She looked at the image on the screen, then at Danielle, then back again. Her pulse quickened. It could not be. Not here. Not like this. Across the room, Richard continued speaking. "Some people believe confidence can replace credentials," he said, drawing scattered laughter from the table. "Unfortunately, corporations do not operate on confidence." Danielle finally looked at him again. "You are right," she said calmly. "They operate on leadership." The response was simple, yet the room reacted as though something heavier had been placed on the table. Richard's smile tightened. Outside, rain continued sliding down the glass. The skyline seemed almost blurred beneath the storm clouds gathering over Chicago. Inside, the atmosphere felt different now, less certain, more fragile. Maya stared at the photograph on her screen. It showed a groundbreaking ceremony from years earlier. Standing beside several investors was a younger Danielle Brooks. The caption beneath the image was partially hidden by archived formatting, but Maya could still read enough to feel her breath catch. She immediately minimized the file when another executive glanced her way. Her hands suddenly felt cold. Richard tapped the table with a pen. "Let us make this easy. Who are you here to represent?" Danielle answered without hesitation. "The future of this company." The room laughed again, but the laughter sounded forced now. Even the people participating seemed unsure why they were laughing. Maya was no longer listening to them. Her eyes remained fixed on Danielle. Piece by piece, a puzzle was assembling itself in her mind. A puzzle nobody else in the room appeared capable of seeing. And as security approached the boardroom from somewhere down the hallway, Maya realized with growing alarm that the most powerful person connected to Whitmore Dynamics might already be standing inside the room they were trying so hard to keep her out of. The boardroom doors opened and two members of the building security team appeared in the hallway. Their arrival should have ended the discussion. Instead, it seemed to deepen it. The room felt charged now, as if everyone sensed something important approaching but could not yet see its shape. Richard Whitmore noticed the hesitation spreading through the room and immediately tried to regain control. "Perfect timing," he said, standing from his chair. "Please escort this woman from the executive floor." The security officers exchanged a quick glance before stepping inside. Neither looked particularly eager. Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she was, calm and composed, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply watched. Richard interpreted her silence as weakness. "You heard me," he continued. "She is not authorized to be here." Thomas Reynolds leaned back in his chair and smiled. "I have to admit," he said, looking toward Danielle, "the confidence is impressive. Most people would have left by now." Several executives chuckled. Another board member adjusted his glasses and added, "Perhaps she thinks this is some kind of networking opportunity." More laughter followed. It rolled around the table in waves, growing louder with each comment. Danielle listened without reacting. Her expression never changed. The security officers remained near the door, waiting for instructions that somehow felt less clear than they should have. Maya Johnson sat frozen behind her tablet. She had reopened the archived records twice already. Each time, she found the same information. The same photograph. The same name. Danielle Brooks. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to say something. She wanted to stop what was happening. But every person in the room seemed so certain, so comfortable, so completely unaware. Richard folded his arms. You know what fascinates me, he said. People walk into places they have not earned and immediately assume they belong. Danielle finally looked directly at him. And how do you decide who has earned a seat at the table? She asked. The question landed harder than anyone expected. Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. Results. Danielle nodded slowly. Interesting answer. The room grew quiet again. Rain continued tapping against the windows 42 floors above Chicago. Beyond the glass, the skyline disappeared behind low gray clouds. Inside, tension settled over the boardroom like a heavy curtain. One of the security officers cleared his throat. Ma'am, we may need to ask you to leave the meeting area. Danielle turned toward him with a polite smile. Of course. Before I do, may I ask one question? The officer hesitated. I suppose. Danielle glanced toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Has anyone here actually spoken to the owner recently? The room went still. Richard answered first. That is none of your concern. Danielle looked back at him. I think it might be. Maya lowered her eyes to her screen again. This time she noticed something she had missed earlier. A recent ownership update. Less than 6 weeks old. Her breath caught. The controlling stake was even larger than she thought. Suddenly the pieces fit together. Every one of them. Maya looked up at Danielle, then toward Richard. A sense of dread settled over her. Because for the first time that morning, she understood exactly how this story was going to end. The only people who did not know were the ones laughing the loudest. Maya Johnson could no longer focus on the meeting agenda displayed on her screen. The numbers blurred together. Revenue forecasts, acquisition targets, quarterly projections. None of it mattered compared to the document sitting open in a hidden corner of her tablet. She read the name again, Danielle Brooks. Then she read it a third time. The ownership records were unmistakable. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through archived filings, executive resolutions, and shareholder reports. Every page confirmed the same truth. Across the room, the woman being treated like an unwanted visitor was connected to Whitmore Dynamics in a way none of the people around the table seemed capable of imagining. Maya looked up. Danielle stood calmly near the entrance, showing no frustration, no fear, no urgency. She looked like someone who already knew exactly how the day would end. Richard Whitmore continued speaking as if he had already won. I believe we have wasted enough time, he announced. The merger discussion cannot move forward until this situation is resolved. Several board members nodded. Thomas Reynolds leaned forward and pointed toward the door. The security team is standing right there. What exactly are we waiting for? One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. Something about the situation felt wrong. Danielle had not raised her voice. She had not interrupted the meeting. She had not refused any instruction. Yet the room spoke about her as though she were the problem. The contrast was becoming difficult to ignore. Maya swallowed hard. She knew she should say something. But challenging the chairman in front of the entire board could end her career. She was 28 years old, 2 years into her corporate role. The youngest person in the room by more than a decade. Every instinct told her to stay quiet. Yet another instinct, stronger and harder to silence, kept telling her that what she was watching was deeply unfair. Richard glanced toward Danielle again. You still have not answered my question. Who exactly are you? Danielle smiled faintly. Someone who cares very much about the future of this company. Thomas laughed. That answer sounds rehearsed. Another executive joined in. Maybe she read it online before coming here. More laughter followed. Maya noticed something remarkable. Danielle never looked offended. If anything, she looked disappointed. Not in herself. In them. The realization unsettled Maya. She returned to the ownership records and opened another file. This one contained photographs from a leadership summit nearly 10 years earlier. Danielle appeared in several images standing beside investors, founders, and senior executives. Not in the background. At the center. Maya felt her heart race. Then she noticed another detail. The boardroom itself. The photographs had been taken in this very room. The same table. The same windows. The same chair sitting empty at the head of the room. Suddenly Maya understood why Danielle kept looking at it. Across the boardroom, Richard placed both hands on the table. This meeting is over for you, he said firmly. You do not belong here. The words echoed through the room. For a brief moment, silence followed. Then Maya heard herself speak before fear could stop her. Actually, she said quietly. Every head turned toward her. The room froze. Richard frowned. Is there something you would like to add? Maya looked from her tablet to Danielle and back again. The weight of the truth pressed against her chest. She was not fully ready to reveal everything. Not yet. But she could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. I think, Maya said carefully, there may be more to this situation than we realize. For the first time that morning, Danielle's eyes met Maya's. And in that brief exchange, Maya understood one thing with absolute certainty. The people laughing now were standing far closer to the edge of disaster than they could possibly imagine. The room seemed to shrink the moment Maya spoke. Every executive turned toward her. Richard Whitmore's expression hardened immediately. The interruption was not part of his plan. Neither was uncertainty. More to what situation? He asked. His voice remained controlled, but the confidence underneath it had begun to crack. Maya looked down at her tablet for a brief second. She could feel dozens of eyes waiting for her answer. The boardroom that had felt enormous an hour earlier suddenly felt very small. I just think we should verify everything before making assumptions, she said carefully. Thomas Reynolds rolled his eyes. Assumptions, he replied. The woman walked into a restricted board meeting without identifying herself. Another executive nodded. Exactly. This is not complicated. Richard seized the moment. Thank you. Finally, some common sense. He turned toward the security officers near the door. Please escort her from the executive floor. Neither officer moved right away. Danielle Brooks noticed their hesitation. She also noticed something else. The room was no longer united. Small cracks had appeared, tiny fractures in the certainty that had fueled the morning. And once doubt enters a room, it rarely leaves empty-handed. One of the officers stepped forward politely. Ma'am, we are being asked to accompany you outside the meeting area. Danielle nodded. I understand. Her calmness made the request feel strangely uncomfortable. She did not argue. She did not resist. She simply reached into her blazer pocket and removed her phone. Richard laughed softly. Calling someone to rescue you. Danielle glanced at him. No. Calling someone who should know what is happening. The response lingered in the air. Richard waved dismissively. Go ahead. Danielle looked at her screen for a moment, but did not place the call yet. Instead, her eyes drifted once more toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Something in her expression changed. Not anger. Not frustration. Memory. 23 years earlier, Danielle had stood in another conference room nearly 1,000 miles away. She had been 23 years old then, the youngest person in the room, the only black woman at the table. She remembered presenting a business proposal she had spent months developing. She remembered the silence that followed. Then came the questions. Not about the proposal. About her. Who was she connected to? Who had helped her write it? Was she really qualified to be there? By the end of that meeting, nobody had discussed her ideas. They had only discussed whether she belonged in the room at all. Danielle remembered leaving that building with tears she refused to let anyone see. She also remembered making a promise. One day she would own the rooms that tried to exclude her. Back in the present, the rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Richard folded his arms. You seem very attached to that chair, he said, noticing her gaze again. Several executives chuckled. Danielle looked directly at him. It represents responsibility. Richard smirked. It represents ownership. Danielle nodded slowly. Exactly. The answer unsettled Maya even more. Because she knew what nobody else knew. She had already seen the records. She had already seen the ownership structure. And with every passing minute, the people around the table were walking deeper into a mistake that could not be undone. Richard pointed toward the door. Enough. This meeting has wasted too much time already. One of the security officers spoke carefully. Ma'am, if you would come with us. Danielle finally unlocked her phone. Her thumb hovered over a single contact. Then she smiled. It was the same smile from earlier. Calm, certain, dangerous. And as she pressed the call button, Maya realized the countdown had already begun. The call connected before the second ring. Danielle Brooks did not move from her position near the boardroom door. She did not step into the hallway. She did not lower her voice. Every person in the room could hear her. Good morning, Angela, she said calmly. I need the acquisition file brought to the executive boardroom immediately. The response came without hesitation. Understood. We are already on our way. Danielle ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. The simplicity of the exchange confused everyone except Maya Johnson. Richard Whitmore laughed first. That is it, he asked. You called someone to bring paperwork? Several executives joined him. The laughter felt forced now, thinner than before. Danielle offered no explanation. She simply waited. The room was beginning to learn that her silence carried more weight than most people's speeches. Richard checked his watch. "We are done here." He looked toward security again. "Please proceed." One of the officers stepped forward politely. "Ma'am, we can accompany you to the reception area while the meeting continues." Danielle nodded. "Of course." Then she looked toward the windows. Rain still streaked across the glass. The city beyond looked distant and gray. "Tell me something," she said quietly. Richard frowned. "What now?" Danielle's eyes moved around the table. "How many of you voted on the acquisition 6 years ago?" The question caught everyone off guard. A few hands slowly rose. Thomas Reynolds raised his immediately. "I did." Another executive nodded. "So did I." Danielle smiled faintly. "Interesting." Richard leaned forward. "What does that have to do with anything?" Danielle looked at him. "Everything." Maya's pulse quickened. She remembered the acquisition file. It was one of the largest corporate transactions in company history. Entire divisions had changed hands. Ownership structures had been rewritten. Careers had been built on that deal. And now Danielle was asking about it for a reason. Richard sensed attention shifting away from him and quickly interrupted. "Enough games. You keep speaking as though you know this company." Danielle answered immediately. "I know it better than most people in this room." Silence followed. Not complete silence. The kind that happens when people want to respond but cannot immediately find the words. Thomas shook his head. "That confidence is remarkable." Danielle turned toward him. "Confidence comes from experience." Across the room, Maya opened another archived file. Her hands moved quickly now. She was no longer searching for confirmation. She already had that. She was searching for details. Dates. Signatures. Voting records. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Every page made the situation worse. Richard remained unaware. He stood and adjusted his jacket again. It was becoming a nervous habit. "You are speaking as though you have authority here." Danielle looked toward the empty chair once more. "Authority is not something you announce," she replied. "It is something people recognize." The answer landed heavily. Even the security officers exchanged glances. Then something changed. A notification appeared on Maya's screen. "Visitor access approved. Executive clearance granted. Multiple arrivals en route to boardroom level." Maya stared at the names attached to the authorization list. Her eyes widened. Chief Legal Counsel. External Audit Chair. Corporate Governance Director. These were not ordinary visitors. These were people who only appeared when decisions of enormous importance were being made. Maya slowly looked up from her tablet. The countdown Danielle had started was reaching its final minutes. Richard continued talking, still convinced he controlled the room. But beyond the boardroom doors, elevators were rising toward the 42nd floor. And with every passing second, the balance of power inside Whitmore Dynamics was moving toward the woman everyone had worked so hard to dismiss. The first sign was not a voice. It was the sound of the boardroom doors opening again. Every head turned at once. 3 people entered without hesitation. Angela Reed walked in first, carrying a leather portfolio. Behind her came the chief legal counsel of Whitmore Dynamics and the chair of the company's external audit committee. Neither looked surprised to see Danielle Brooks standing near the door. In fact, both of them walked directly toward her. The room froze. Richard Whitmore remained standing, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Nobody answered him immediately. Angela stopped beside Danielle and handed her the portfolio. "Everything is ready," she said. "The complete acquisition file, ownership records, and current governance resolutions." Danielle accepted it with a nod. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it changed the atmosphere of the room completely. Thomas Reynolds looked around uneasily. Several board members straightened in their chairs. Maya Johnson lowered her tablet. She already knew what was coming. The others did not. Richard stepped forward. "I asked a question." This time the chief legal counsel answered. "And it is about to be answered." The room fell silent. Danielle opened the portfolio and removed a thin stack of documents. She walked slowly toward the head of the table. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even tried. Moments earlier they had treated her like an outsider. Now they watched her with growing uncertainty. The empty chair waited at the end of the room. The same chair Richard had spent the morning protecting. The same chair he insisted belonged to the owner. Danielle placed the documents on the table and rested one hand on the back of the chair. Richard frowned. You cannot sit there. Danielle looked at him calmly. Can I not? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples moved across every face in the room. The chief legal counsel opened a folder. For the record, he said, his voice steady and formal. The controlling shareholder of Whitmore Dynamics currently holds 54% voting authority and retains full governance rights under the acquisition agreement executed 6 years ago. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Thomas leaned forward. What does that have to do with this meeting? Angela answered before anyone else could. Everything. Danielle slowly took her seat. The chair seemed to fit her naturally, as though it had been waiting for her return. Richard's face lost color. Maya watched the realization spread through the room one person at a time, like lights turning on in a dark building. Danielle folded her hands on the table. Her voice remained calm. You spent the last hour asking who I was. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Danielle continued. You questioned my presence. You questioned my authority. You questioned whether I belonged in this room. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Danielle's eyes settled on him. You told security to remove me from a boardroom I own. The silence that followed seemed to stop time itself. Even the rain against the windows felt distant now. One executive lowered his gaze. Another stared at the documents in disbelief. Thomas Reynolds looked as though he had forgotten how to speak. Danielle did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The problem was never that you did not know who I was, she said. The problem was how comfortable you became disrespecting someone you assumed had no power. And for the first time all morning, nobody in the room had an answer. The silence after Danielle's words felt heavier than any argument that had filled the room all morning. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smirked. The confidence that had surrounded Richard Whitmore less than 10 minutes earlier had vanished completely. He remained standing beside the table, staring at the ownership records spread before him as though reading them a second time might somehow change what they said. It did not. The numbers remained the same. The signatures remained the same. The authority remained exactly where it had always been. Danielle Brooks sat calmly at the head of the table, the position everyone had worked so hard to keep her from reaching. Outside, the rain continued falling over Chicago. Inside, an entirely different storm was unfolding. The chief legal counsel opened another folder and placed several documents in front of the board. For transparency, he said, these records confirm that Ms. Brooks remains the majority owner, principal founder, and chair of the governance committee. Thomas Reynolds lowered his eyes. Another executive removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. One by one, the reality settled over the room. Richard finally found his voice. There has to be some misunderstanding. Angela Reed looked directly at him. There is no misunderstanding. Her answer arrived with the precision of a closing door. Maya Johnson watched quietly. Earlier, she had felt nervous. Now she felt something else. Relief. The truth no longer had to fight for space in the room. It had taken over the room completely. Danielle folded her hands and looked around the table. I reviewed the meeting agenda before arriving this morning, she said. I was interested in seeing how leadership functioned when it believed nobody was watching. Nobody responded. Several executives avoided eye contact entirely. Danielle continued. What I observed was disappointing. Richard tried again. You intentionally concealed your identity. Danielle looked at him calmly. No, I walked into a boardroom. The answer hit harder than any accusation, because everyone understood what she meant. She had not lied. She had not created confusion. The assumptions had come from them. The judgment had come from them. The exclusion had come from them. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We did not know. Danielle nodded slowly. Exactly. The room fell silent again. Then the external audit chair spoke for the first time. There is another matter that requires immediate attention. Every head turned. He opened a report and adjusted his glasses. This morning's conduct represents a serious governance concern. Richard's expression tightened. The audit chair continued. Multiple witnesses, documented directives, and boardroom records confirm repeated attempts to exclude the controlling owner from a formal meeting. The words landed with devastating clarity. What had felt like an embarrassing mistake only minutes ago now sounded like an official finding. Danielle remained composed. She showed no satisfaction, no anger, only certainty. The legal counsel slid another document across the table. Richard glanced down at it and immediately looked away. His executive access review had already begun. Governance protections were activating in real time. The system was moving exactly as it had been designed to move. Quietly, efficiently, irreversibly. Maya noticed the change spread through the room. Some executives looked shocked. Others looked ashamed. A few simply looked exhausted. Danielle stood slowly from the chair. Every eye followed her. Leadership is revealed in moments when power seems unequal, she said. This morning, many of you believed I had none. And that belief told me everything I needed to know. No one challenged her. No one interrupted. Because for the first time all day, the room was finally listening. For several seconds after Danielle Brooks finished speaking, nobody moved. The boardroom felt transformed. The same room that had welcomed judgment now seemed unable to produce a single excuse. Rain continued tracing lines down the glass walls overlooking Chicago, but even the storm outside felt quieter than the silence around the table. Richard Whitmore stared at the documents in front of him. The authority he had relied upon all morning had dissolved under the weight of facts. Across the room, Maya Johnson finally allowed herself to exhale. What had begun as a feeling, then a suspicion, had become undeniable truth. Danielle looked around the boardroom one final time. She recognized the expressions. Shock, regret, embarrassment. She had seen them before. Not just here, but throughout her life. 23 years earlier, she had walked out of a conference room questioning whether she would ever be allowed into spaces where decisions were made. Now she stood at the center of one of the most important companies in the country, not because someone gave her permission, but because she had built the foundation beneath it. The difference was never talent. The difference was opportunity. The legal counsel quietly gathered several folders while the audit chair continued documenting the morning's events. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontations. The system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Accountability was unfolding through procedure, not emotion. Danielle appreciated that. Real leadership was not about humiliation. It was about standards. Thomas Reynolds finally spoke. I owe you an apology. Danielle looked at him for a moment. You owe yourself reflection. The answer settled over the room. Several executives lowered their eyes again. Because she was right. An apology could address a moment. Reflection could change a future. Richard remained silent. For the first time all morning, he seemed to understand that the issue was larger than a mistaken assumption. The issue was how quickly those assumptions had become actions. Danielle stepped away from the head of the table and walked toward the windows. The city stretched beneath her. Millions of people beginning their day. Most of them would never enter a boardroom like this one. Yet every decision made here would eventually affect their lives. That responsibility mattered. She turned back toward the table. This company was never built to reward titles, she said. It was built to reward vision, character, and performance. The moment we start judging people by appearances instead of contributions, we weaken everything we claim to stand for. Nobody interrupted. Nobody disagreed. The room listened. Really listened. Danielle smiled softly. Not because she had won. This was never about winning. It was about truth finally occupying the space where assumptions had lived. Maya watched her with admiration. The most powerful person in the building had never needed to shout. She had never demanded respect. She had simply revealed reality and allowed it to speak for itself. Danielle moved toward the door and paused. Her final words were calm, measured, and unforgettable. I did not raise my voice today. I raised the standard. And from this moment forward, that standard belongs to everyone in this room. Then she walked into the hallway, leaving behind a boardroom that looked exactly the same as it had that morning, yet felt completely different. Because the people inside it would never see that empty chair the same way again.